Hi guys, I'm Emily.
I'm Greg.
Welcome back to Telltale. Today we're gonna go through our top 10 favorite books between the two of us. So there's gonna be 20 in all.
Yeah.
Bear with us. We're gonna give you just quick overviews of our top 10s and why. And then we're gonna, let you know why we like them, or if we like the author, why we like the authors. And we're gonna, get rolling, I guess.
The interesting thing is there's no overlap in our lists because we didn't talk about what's going on whose list here.
We did not collaborate at all as to which of our favorites were which. So, speaking of which, first one I'm going to talk about is Ragwitch by Garth Nix. This is not the only Garth Nix book in my top 10. I really like him a lot. He's very good at writing. This is kind of a fun fantasy fairy tale one where two kids kind of get warped into an alternate dimension of quirky, fun characters. So it's more of a young adult feeling book, but it's just really well written and it's really well done. The characters are fairly believable to a point. Of course, it's a fantasy work, so there are some that are, probably not at all realistic, but it's a very original idea. It is about a witch that is basically a rag doll. And it kind of like accumulates souls of people and stuff. So this little girl's brother, while they're on the beach, finds it, and now she has to rescue him because
So it has multiple personalities, or
just
only one
collects
soul at a
children
time?
or something like that. It's a really just fun kind of. And it's been years since I've read this. I should reread it, but
How long has it been around? Because I've heard the name more recently now that I'm getting back into reading, but I never heard
around
of it
a while. Yeah, I'm the worst when it comes. 1990.
That long ago.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with Garth Nix.
Copywritten in 1990 by Garth Nix. All rights reserved.
I'll have to try him sometime.
A good one. He has some really nice. He does a lot of sci-fi stuff too. So like the Seven Tower series, Shade's Children, the Aberson series, which good segue. Number 2. I don't actually know if this is pronounced Sabriel or Sabriel. So I guess it's, one of those things where you can slaughter the language however you like. Because you have the freedom to do so. But yeah, I've never actually heard anybody read it or I've never even heard him say it.
You never heard the audio?
Yeah, I've never heard the audiobook. So I'm like, I only know, I've always said it was Sabriel because I like long A's instead of hard A's.
Okay.
But it could be Sabriel. I know people who call it Sabriel. But this is also by Garth Nix. It's about a young lady who lives in a realm that's split between two worlds, but there's a wall that just basically separates them. One has magic on one side and one magic doesn't work on the other side of the wall. So she's living at a boarding school on the other side of the wall, and her father works as the Aberson, whose job is to put the dead back down when necromancers resurrect them and try to take over the world.
Okay.
Pretty standard storyline. But then her father goes missing, and she has to go figure out what happened to him. So she travels over there and has to figure out where he's gone off to. So this is another really original storyline. Great world building. That's what I like about Garth Nix. And for a male author, he's really good at writing female characters. They feel really realistic.
Okay.
So they don't feel like he doesn't objectify women a lot, like sometimes happens in fantasy and sci-fi things. Like everything, the emotions that the females are going through or like the characters that he's building, they feel really realistic. Like I can put myself in their shoes and feel like that's exactly how I would behave in this situation. Like I would feel the same. If I had a sense of duty like she did, sure. Yeah, that would totally happen. So really good plausible deniability in these books. So they feel really well built. And I feel that way about everything. There isn't a single book by Garth Nix I haven't liked, to be honest. But I haven't read them all yet. So we'll see. My next one, another favorite author of mine, Neuromancer by William Gibson.
I'm trying to find my copy of that. I can't find it yet.
Yeah?
It's somewhere lost in my attic.
Really? So this is like my introduction to kind of cyberpunk thrillers. Like I had read Garth Exchange Children, which is kind of a similar thing, but it's got a lot of deviation. It's like a sci-fi fantasy sort of thing, whereas this is really just tech sci-fi. This is really classic technology-based science fiction. So I really enjoy William Gibson's work a lot. He's got a lot of hackers in his stuff who are trying to, solve mysteries or, steal money or things like that. So Neuromancer was a really good introduction, I think, to sci-fi. If anybody wants to get introduced to sci-fi, again, really good world building, really good characters, all very believable. Some are a little douchey, but I mean, you don't have a good story unless there's a really douchey character in there somewhere, because no world is perfect and jerks are everywhere.
Exactly. You don't like everybody in real life, why would you like everybody in a book?
Yeah. So I really enjoy William Gibson as an author as well. And Neuromancer was my first introduction, so of course I hold it very near and dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it's one of those things where guy's a data thief, and he's gets kind of a calling from some big name people who are also big name hackers to try and figure out some stuff and get some dirt on some families that are really big in the technological world. So, and he also wants to get some dirt on, I guess there's like this artificial intelligence thing that's kind of the overarching theme, where he's trying to get information about this artificial intelligence ultimately, but he kind of has to jump around and figure out who knows what to kind of get there. So it's really, really interesting, very original. All right, this is one of my other favorites. Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is a classic. I read it in high school for the very first time because we had to do a book report on it. Yeah. And of course, it's one of those very controversial books because it romanticizes African American life in the Deep South before civil rights.
Oh.
So it's kind of one of those things where there's this African American character, and it's kind of going through her life from kind of young adult into adulthood. And she has multiple lovers along the way, and different relationships and different situations and the places she's lived, and a lot of them are very tragic. It's not pretty, but Zora writes everything as if it's poetry, which I think I appreciate the most about her work. She also was a very famous poet, and very, very avid feminist, huge on social justice in all its forms. Like, she was really into social justice, but which is kind of unusual because when you read this book, it romanticizes so much about Deep South life for African Americans, especially women. Mm-hmm. It almost seems out of character for her, because you would think she'd be writing more about the bad and ugly situations, but she has a lot of very beautiful things that happen in her literature as well. So there's a lot of hopefulness and poetry that I really enjoy about her work, and this is one of my favorites of hers. It's also a really quick read. Like, I read this in a day. We had several weeks that we were going over this, and I read the whole book in a day and had to keep rereading it to remember what the previous things were and remember details for when we did quizzes and stuff. Mm-hmm. So this one was a really good one. Lots of great poetry, lots of great quotes from this one too.
Cool.
All right, and here's my other, Jane Eyre, another classic by one of the Bronte sisters, Charlotte. I actually like this edition in particular because it is illustrated by Dame Darcy, who is an independent illustrator. She's like so super underground. Like, she does indie music, and she has an Etsy shop where you can buy this stuff from, and she makes like art dolls, and she makes like, I follow her on Instagram. She makes these cool little like cinema old style like vaudeville feeling movies and stuff. She has a comic series called Meat Cake that's really interesting. It's like a bunch of circus freaks living together and their romances and all kinds of stuff. So she does some really cool work, but let me see if I can find. She does great, really like expressive illustrations and stuff. I do love Tim Burton a lot, but I feel like she's the female Tim Burton who didn't sell out.
Okay.
That's like the best way I can describe it to people.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do I love Charlotte Bronte because she's another one who's very poetic, very realistic when she writes storylines. And one of the things I really appreciated about Jane Eyre was she and her sister kind of had a debate about if you can write a book with a protagonist who was female who wasn't pretty or beautiful and still have people like her.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like Jane Eyre was really successful that way. She still had a thriving romance, but she's realistic. She's a very plain woman. Yeah. She has a very plain life. Like, everything she's done has been, there's nothing super spectacular about her as a person. She just happens to have a lot of very unfortunate or dramatic series of events happen to her. Mm-hmm. So, and I think just pairing this with the illustrations from Dame Darcy, it just really is a great addition to have. I really highly recommend people do that. This is not sponsored at all. I literally am just saying this because I really enjoy Dame Darcy and I really enjoy Charlotte Bronte, and I think this work just pairs Dame Darcy's artistry well with a story, because this is considered a gothic romance, and Dame Darcy does a really good job portraying that with her illustrations. Mm-hmm. So this one's more of an interesting walkthrough. This is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Este. She's a doctor.
If I remember right, you just read that.
Yeah,
recently.
And it took me a really long time to get through it because it was all fascinating, but it delves very deeply into psychology. So what it is basically Dr. Clarissa goes through and she finds legends from different cultures around the world. She goes through the Jungian archetypes, and she kind of describes what each of those characters in each of the stories means or represents, either by archetype or kind of basing it off this concept of the archetype of wild woman mostly, but also focusing on the different archetypes that archetype has to interact with and how they behave and what each one represents differently across the board. Like, it's a full spectrum of psychological, what's the word I'm looking for? Psychological, I guess, assessment of different characters and how we as people can kind of harbor those same archetypes within ourselves and how they interact with each other and what they mean and what they don't mean. But there's a lot of interesting folklore in this one from all over the place, a lot of things I had never read before or had never even heard about. And she kind of builds them and lets you know if there are alternative endings, or like if the object in the story that's kind of like the magical object or the goal object or things like that. She'll tell you if it's different across different cultures and which ones. So really well researched. And it's very profound. There's a lot of wisdom in this. I wish every man, woman, and child would read this book.
Okay.
It just builds really good understanding of the self. And especially, I think, for men, it helps them build an understanding of the psyche of women to the degree that they can empathize and understand. So I think it's just really well done in a way that it uses storytelling to kind of talk about the human condition and really simplifies it, because there's a lot of complexity, of course, to the human condition, but it simplifies it well just using traditional stories. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed this one a lot. I wish everybody would read it. This is a fairly new book. I just got it for Christmas. My husband knows I love Victorian literature.
Okay.
And he got it for me as a gift, which was mighty bold of him. Like, it's hard to give books as a gift, but this is the first book in a long time that I've laughed out loud hysterically at some of the quotes in this. It's giving you actual information about how women conducted life, things that we don't think about, like what did they do when they had their period? Were undergarments really that big of a corsets really that bad? How did they conduct their households? How did they do dating? How did they do, just all this stuff that we probably have always had questions about. And of course, that romantic literature is not going to talk to you about. Yeah. It's not going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's just going to tell you the good. But yeah, this was really great because it gives you all that actual information without like making it really dry. It sprinkles in so much humor that it's fantastic. Therese O'Neill is a comedian. She's really good at writing these. She has another one on parenting in the Victorian era that I really want to read. But this one was just fantastic. Just the kid, she kind of does it conversationally. So it's like she's talking at you about, here's how you're conducting your life. You are the Victorian woman in the Victorian era dealing with these situations. Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry. Like basically the whole time she's like, back in the 20th century or whatever, yeah, you have it real nice. Here you're not even a person kind of thing. Yeah. So she's just really realistic about it, but presents it in a very comedic way where it's still entertaining. So I really like this one too. And it's such a newer book, but just so good. Really hilarious. This one is a fairly recent one as well. This is Gutenbergs Apprentice by Alex Christie? I think it's Christie. So I got into this book because I enjoy letterpress printing as a hobby. I have done some professional things, but we all hear about the original story of, Gutenberg invented the printing press and he published the very first mass-produced Bible with it and all this stuff. So what I appreciate about this book is while it is a fiction, it is really well researched and fairly historically accurate. So there's, some of the court cases that they bring up because Gutenberg was kind of a jerk. He, really? He broke several engagements. I think they only talk about one in here. Okay. But he, back then, if you break an engagement, especially if the female is well off, you're kind of in trouble, and they can have you for all you're worth. Uh-huh. So he's done stuff like that. He did a lot of very things that could be considered underhanded, but he was an entrepreneur. Ultimately, he wasn't looking to really make a name for himself per se. He was looking to make money. Yeah. And that's all he cared about. Mm-hmm. So this kind of portrays him in that light. While we don't know for sure if that's the kind of personality we have enough information to know that he left a bit of a paper trail, pun intended. So we do have a lot of information about it. So characters are really realistic. It's told from the perspective of one of his apprentices who is not actually a real person, I don't believe. At least I can't find anything about if he was actually a real person or not.
Probably had to have somebody helping him.
Yeah, he had a team and lots of goldsmiths and metalsmiths and lots of debt. He was really good at debt. But yeah, so it kind of goes through the process of the making of, but also from the perspective of this young man who's his apprentice, who's also got life going on the side too. Like he's trying to get engaged to this girl and he's trying to advance his career because he used to be he was a scribe by trade and then was asked by his stepfather kind of person, adopted father, I guess, actually, to step in and help his partner, who was Gutenberg at the time, because he just didn't think that after if their invention was successful, he didn't think his son really had a profession anymore. So he was kind of saying, you know, you owe me this being your adopted father, and, you know, you owe me this as my only son, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I really need you to just kind of stay and keep an eye on him for me, because, of course, he didn't trust him. And they build the character really well. By the end of it, you're just like, oh, I hate you, Gutenberg. You're such a jerk. But, yeah, so it's a really interesting, very dramatic story with a lot going on, a lot of church politics and stuff. They didn't make the church out to be evil, but they certainly were realistic about the political hold that the church had, which I also appreciated. Mm-hmm. So nobody was really a hero. It was just kind of real life, nitty gritty. This is all business, and this is how we're going to get into it. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciated it for that. And very entertaining. Like, lots of great humor in here. Lots of really absurd situations. Lots of really guys being guys in the workshop and doing silly things to each other. So it feels like a real life story. Like, just shop talk and things like that. So it's a really great one. Uh-huh. I got 2 more, guys. We're almost there. This is another one. The Lady in Gold. This is based off a true story. Actually, it is the true story of the painting, The Lady in Gold, and it's way back to its original family, because it had been stolen by the Nazis after Klimt's death and stuff. It was from a very wealthy Austrian family, had it done, and the subject of it was actually Jewish, and yet Nazi Germany decided not to destroy it. They decided to keep it, and they stole it, and then it found its way into the Austrians' National Art Museum and art archives. Uh-huh. So it opened up this huge case about who actually has ownership of all these art pieces that the Nazis ended up stealing when they relocated all the Jewish families when they occupied Austria. So it just became this really pivotal, I guess it became an actual case. It was the family against the country of Austria, essentially, to get this painting back in the family. Uh-huh. So it's just a really fascinating, kind of goes through Klimt and the relationship to the family of the I can't remember, Bloch-Bauer. I think I'm saying that right. The Bloch-Bauer family. Kind of that relationship going, and it gives you a lot of context to everything that's going on. Like, talks about Mark Twain and the time he spent in Austria here, but it gives you a good social climate, understanding what's really going on. Yeah. How Nazi Germany was able to take over, how they went from being illegal in Austria to suddenly being the ruling government. Mm-hmm. So that's really fascinating. What happened to the family, where everybody went, who they got married to later in life, where they all ended up, and then the day they just, one of the family members was just like, that's ours. We need it back. We need to do something. Do we even have a case? And just going to the lawyer, and the process of the lawyer going and finding out, do we even have a case? And can we even defend this? And they successfully did it. The family got the portrait back. So it's a really fascinating story. A lot of very tragic, of course, things, because it's during the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is messy. But it's interesting to see art history in the Holocaust versus hearing just about situations with people getting captured and going into ghettos. It's kind of like you're seeing what happens to art when they go into their own versions of the ghettos and where they get stored and what happened to them, and who burned what and who stole what, and they can actually follow the paper trail of who owned what when, because the Nazis were so good at keeping track of who got what when they were divvying up estates to the Nazi generals. Mm-hmm. So they were really good at keeping records, which is what incriminated them in this case. Yeah. They figured that out. And then there was also a will and testament from Adele Bloch-Bauer, the subject of the painting, her husband, and herself. Those 2 wills actually were pivotal in figuring out whether or not this painting should have gone to the museum or not. Mm-hmm. So that was really, really a fascinating story. Also a great film. definitely recommend the book, though, because
Oh.
you get way more social background. You don't just get the family's history. You
Yeah.
get everybody. Freud's in it. Twain's in it. You know, royalty's in it. So it just gives you this really glamorous look of what Austria was before the Nazi takeover and just how Nazi Germany destroyed Austria's culture. So it's really interesting. Highly recommend it. So my last book is Liquid Jade. This is also a history of tea.
Oh.
I am a tea collector and tea set collector, so I've always been fascinated with tea, the different kinds of china and things you can get, as well as the British culture surrounding, like the very Western culture of tea, which is interesting because it is so different than the Eastern culture of tea. This book covers both. It tells you about how the Eastern culture treated tea, about teaism, Buddhism, Taoism, how they all played a role in developing the philosophies, including developing the tea. A lot of thought and philosophy kind of built this entire culture around tea. So it's really interesting. It also talks about the East India Trading Company. It talks about how basically tea was mass-produced, how it came to be common for people to suddenly be able to obtain. Talks about penny universities, where you used to go to tea houses, and for a penny you'd get a cup of tea, and certain tea houses were really good at attracting, like they just kind of just attracted their own culture. So the philosophers were known for going to this particular tea house. The scientists were known for going to this particular tea house. The writers went to this particular tea house. So you kind of got a common man education surrounding these tea houses in Europe for, several centuries, because tea was not mass produced to the public. So lots of really fascinating information, really well written, not dry, very poetic. Really great philosophy, very thought-provoking. But, tea has affected, it's basically built Western and Eastern cultures. Like, I am amazed at how much tea was involved in social justice for women in the suffrage movement. How influential it was for the economics of Europe, how it was influential to the economics and the exploitation, unfortunately, of India. How international trade was basically built by tea.
Oh, it started the American Revolution.
It was such an influential item for being a consumable good. You can't say the same about bacon. But, I don't know if war's ever been started over bacon, but...
Only at the breakfast table.
Yeah, tea has been such an internationally renowned consumable good for so long. And this kind of gives you a really brief but thoughtful and thorough look at how influential it's actually been. And how there's not a continent that the tea trade hasn't touched. It's become such a big industry. It was and still is a big industry, that it's become part of almost every single culture.
Okay.
So it's a really fascinating one. That's the last one.
Okay.
Those are all 10.
Wow.
Now I can breathe.
Yeah, well, that was a very interesting list, and nothing that was really expected, except maybe Jane Eyre. That's a very, very popular book. But the rest of them are all things, well, I've heard of Neuromancer. The rest of them are all books I've never heard of before.
Oh, good.
So that's a very interesting list.